November 27, 1943. An airstrip on an island called Betio, 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide. A transport plane comes in low over water, still burning in places. The engineers on the ground stop what they are doing. They stop because they were told an admiral was coming. They did not expect him to walk off that plane alone. He is 58 years old. 4 stars on his collar. His name is Chester Nimitz. He is the man who runs the Pacific War. 4 days earlier, more than 1,000 American Marines had died on the beach he is now standing on. The island has not yet buried all of them. He does not say anything. He does not need to. He starts walking. 17 days after that walk, in a conference room at Pearl Harbor, 3 of the finest military minds in the United States Navy will tell him he is about to make a reckless, dangerous, outright reckless mistake. He will not listen to any of them. This is the story of what he did next, and why history forgot it. December 14, 1943, a conference room at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Chester Nimitz sits at the head of the table. He has been running the Pacific War for almost exactly 2 years, from the day he took command on the deck of the submarine Grieving on the 31st of December, 1941, because there was no battleship left at Pearl Harbor for him to stand on. To his right, Vice Admiral Raymond Spruance, 57 years old, commander of the 5th Fleet, quiet, analytical, the kind of officer who never raised his voice because he never had to. Across from him, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, 58, the man who ran the amphibious landings, hot-tempered, blunt, the kind of officer who did raise his voice often. And beside Turner, Marine Lieutenant General Holland Smith, 61. They called him Howlin Mad Smith for reasons that were not a mystery to anyone who had served under him. 3 of the finest military minds the United States had produced. 3 men who had spent their entire adult lives preparing for exactly this kind of decision. Nimitz looked at each of them in turn. Then he asked the question, "Gentlemen, what do you think?" Spruance answered first. "Too dangerous. Turner next. Reckless. Outright reckless." Holland Smith agreed. "Take the outer islands first. Watch ya. Malawalap. Build your way in. Don't go straight at Kwajalein. Not yet." 3 men, 3 answers. All the same. Now here is what you need to understand about the man sitting at the head of that table. 3 weeks before that meeting, Chester Nimitz had stood on a beach called Betio. Betio is a tiny island in Tarawa Atoll, 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide, the kind of place you could walk the length of in under an hour. The Marines had taken it on November 20th, 76 hours of fighting, more than 1,000 Americans dead by the time the guns went quiet. When Nimitz landed on November 27th, 4 days after the last shot, the island had not yet buried all its dead. He walked the length of it anyway. Not a single coconut palm was still standing. Every tree gone, every bunker collapsed or burned. The sand itself churned up, and black in places from the weight of the bombardment. Men with shovels still working in the heat. The smell of something that had no name in polite language. He had been in the Navy for 30 years. Nothing had prepared him for this. The men tasked with burying the dead had been working for 4 days. There were not enough of them. The island was only 2 miles long. There was nowhere to go that was far from the work they still had left to do. Nimitz did not write much about what he saw. Some things resist language. But here is what he knew, standing on that beach, that no one sitting safely in Washington could fully understand. The men who died at Tarawa did not die because they weren't brave enough. They died because the tide didn't come in. The assault plan had called for 5 feet of water over the reef at each hour. That would have been enough for the Higgins boats, the flat-bottomed landing craft, to clear the coral and reach the beach. But November 20th, 1943, was one of the 2 days each year when a neap tide holds the water down. The reef sat 3 feet beneath the surface that morning, maybe less. The boats scraped to a halt 800 yards from shore. 800 yards. The Marines climbed over the sides and waded in, chest-deep water, then waist-deep, then knee-deep, the entire way under fire. The landing craft that couldn't move sat there in the open water, taking Japanese machine gun rounds until they sank or burned. 125 amphibious tractors, the tracked vehicles that could actually crawl over the reef, had been allocated for the assault. By the end of the fighting, most of them were gone. The naval bombardment had lasted 3 hours, 3 hours against bunkers built from coconut logs and reinforced concrete, built to absorb exactly this kind of punishment, built by men who had been fortifying this island for 2 years. The shells had hit. The bunkers had not cared. Tarawa was not a failure of courage. It was a failure of planning. And every man who died in that surf knew the difference, even if he could not say so. Nimitz came home from Betio and sat down at his desk. The letters were waiting. Howlin Mad, his aide, his gatekeeper, the man who managed everything that came in and out of the Admiral's office, had tried to set them aside. Lamar understood that Nimitz was carrying the entire Pacific War. He understood that the Admiral did not need, on top of everything else, to read letters from grieving mothers. Nimitz disagreed. He read them, every one, hundreds of them, arriving every day, from small towns in Ohio, from farms in Georgia, from neighborhoods in Boston and Pittsburgh and San Diego, where young men had grown up playing baseball, and then gone to the Pacific and had not come back. The letters did not mince words. You killed my son. My boy is dead because of you. What was it for? Nimitz wrote back to every one of them. No form letter, no template. He sat at his desk in the evenings and he wrote. He told his wife he was just as distressed as could be. He used the word prayed in his own private correspondence. He actually wrote prayed. For the war to end, to stop the killing, to stop the maiming. He visited the hospitals. He walked the wards. He sat beside the beds of men who had lost arms, lost legs, lost things that could not be named in a letter home. He stood beside the bed of a 19-year-old sailor who was dying. He told the young man that he was proud of him, that his country was proud of him. The sailor died at peace. Nimitz walked back out into the corridor, and the next morning he came back to his desk, and he began to make his decisions. Here is the thing no history book quite captures about what Chester Nimitz was facing. He knew Tarawa was right, not the way it was executed, that was wrong, and he knew it. And he would spend the next 2 months making sure it never happened that way again. But the decision to take Tarawa, that was right. You needed that airfield, you needed that base, you needed Tarawa to reach the Marshalls. You needed the Marshalls to reach the Marianas. You needed the Marianas to put B-29s within range of Tokyo. Every link in that chain was necessary. The only question that mattered. How do you keep fighting and lose fewer men doing it? How do you take the next island and bring more of them home? That was what Nimitz was working out, sitting at that desk, reading those letters, writing those answers back. Every decision he made from that point forward, every choice about where to strike, when to strike, how to strike, was shaped by what he had seen on Betio. Not as a lesson learned in an after-action report, as something he had walked through, felt underfoot, carried home in his uniform. He was going to fix it. The photographs came back in late November. Reconnaissance planes had been running sorties over the Marshall Islands for weeks before the December meeting. High-altitude passes, low-altitude passes, every atoll in the chain photographed and rephotographed. When the analysts finished their work, the maps went up on the wall at Pearl Harbor, and something unexpected stared back. The outer islands, Watcher, Malolap, Mili, Jaluit, they were fortified exactly as expected. Airfields, coastal guns, reinforced defensive positions, thousands of Japanese troops dug in and waiting. Kwajalein, the central atoll, the Japanese administrative headquarters in the Marshalls, the place they had held since before the war began. Kwajalein was lighter, not undefended, not easy, but significantly weaker than what surrounded it. The reason it turned out was simple. The Japanese commander in the Marshalls was a man named Masashi Kobayashi, Rear Admiral, career officer. He had looked at the American pattern, the cautious, methodical, island-hopping approach, and he had concluded that the United States would do what any sensible military force would do. Work from the outside in, take the near islands first, establish air bases, reduce the risk, then come for the center. So he had concentrated his strength on the outer ring. He was waiting for exactly the attack he expected, which meant that if Nimitz hit where the Japanese were not expecting, straight at the center, skipping the outer islands entirely, he would catch the strongest Japanese position in the Marshalls at its most vulnerable moment. It was the kind of intelligence that changes everything, or changes nothing, depending on who is reading it. Nimitz's senior planner, Rear Admiral Forrest Sherman, looked at those photographs and said one word. Feasible. His chief of staff, Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, agreed. Feasible. Not safe, not certain, not without risk. Feasible. That was enough for Nimitz to call the December 14th meeting. He gathered Spruance, Turner, Holland, Smith. He laid out the intelligence. He explained what the photographs showed. And then he did something that was, in its own way as revealing as anything he would say that day. He went around the room. He asked each man individually what he thought. Spruance first. Raymond, what do you think? Then Turner. Then Smith. He wanted to hear them out, every objection, every concern, every reason it might go wrong. They gave it to him. Spruance laid out the strategic danger. Kwajalein sat deep inside Japanese-controlled waters. Enemy airfields on those outer islands would surround the fleet on every side. Supply lines would be exposed if something went wrong, if the landing stalled, if the Japanese reinforced faster than expected. There was no fallback position. Turner went further. The plan was dangerous, outright reckless. The outer islands had to be taken first. That was the proper military sequence. The Navy had done it that way for a reason. Holland Smith, who had argued before for Tarawa that the whole Gilbert Islands campaign was misconceived, found himself on the same side as Turner. Take watch in Malalap first. Build your air cover, then move on Kwajalein. The three men finished. The room was quiet. No one had said anything Nimitz hadn't already considered. He had been sitting with these objections for 2 weeks, running them against the photographs, running them against the intelligence on Japanese dispositions, running them against every piece of information that had come across his desk since he had walked off that airstrip on Betio. He looked around the table. Then he said it quietly. Well, gentlemen, our next target will be Kwajalein. Most of the men in that room gathered their papers and left. Spruance and Turner stayed. Whatever decorum had governed the formal meeting, it was over now. The two admirals pressed their case directly. This plan was dangerous and reckless. They said those words to his face, the same words Turner had used at the table. Nimitz listened. He was not a man who raised his voice. He was not a man who ended arguments with rank. In 30 years of the Navy, the people who had worked closest to him had almost uniformly described him the same way. Calm, approachable, genuinely open to being wrong. But there is a difference between being open to being wrong and being willing to let someone else's fear make your decision. Nimitz let them finish. Then he said what he said. If you don't want to do it, I'll find someone who will. That was the end of it. Spruance and Turner walked out of the room. The decision had been made. What no one in that room could know. What no one could possibly know is that Rear Admiral Masashi Kobayashi, sitting in his headquarters on Kwajalein at that very moment, had already made his own decision. He had read the American pattern. He had moved his best troops, his heaviest guns, his finest fortifications out to Watcha, out to Malalap. He was ready for an attack that was not coming. There is something that never quite makes it into the official histories about the kind of decision Nimitz made in that room. The histories will tell you he had good intelligence, that the photograph supported the plan, that the logic was sound. All of that is true. What the histories don't say as plainly is this. He didn't know, not for certain. Not in the way you can be certain about a math problem or a set of verified facts. He had evidence. He had analysis. He had instinct built from 30 years of understanding how navies fight and how men break under fire. But between the evidence and the certainty, there was a gap. There is always a gap. Nimitz knew it was there. He crossed it anyway, because the alternative, the safe, sensible, methodical alternative that his three best commanders were begging him to take, meant more weeks of bombing outer islands, more weeks of Japanese engineers reinforcing Kwajalein, more weeks of young men crossing oceans toward a target that was getting harder to take with every day that passed. He had walked that beach. He was not going to send more men to walk one just like it out of an abundance of caution. He did not move. The next 60 days would decide whether he was right. On the voyage back from Tarawa, Rear Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner sat down at a table somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and started writing. Turner had been the loudest voice in the room. He had told Nimitz to his face that the Kwajalein plan was reckless. He had argued for the methodical approach. He had lost that argument. And now, on the long voyage home, he did something that told you everything you needed to know about the kind of officer he actually was. He picked up a pen and he started fixing what had gone wrong. He called the document recommendations for changes and improvements in tactics, techniques, existing instructions, and material. It was not a short document. Back at Pearl Harbor, Nimitz's own planning officer, Captain James Steele, put together a companion piece. He called his version something more direct. 100 mistakes made on Tarawa. 100. That document became the operating manual for everything that followed. Every man who died on Betio had in some sense contributed a line to that list. The tide calculation, written down. The bombardment timeline, written down. The landing craft specifications, written down. The communication failures between ships and shore, written down. The shortage of amphibious tractors, written down. The failure to scout the reef conditions in the final hours, written down. Everything that had gone wrong on November 20th. Everything that had put Marines in chest-deep water, 800 yards from the beach, covered by machine guns, was now on paper, with a proposed fix beside it. By the time the fleet assembled for Kwajalein, 5 specific changes had been made that did not exist at Tarawa. First, the naval bombardment. At Betio, the ships had fired for 3 hours. They had fired from a distance considered safe, far enough back that the big guns could shell the island without putting the ships themselves in immediate danger. The shells had been high explosive rounds. They had detonated on contact with the surface, against open positions, open trenches, open ground. They were devastating, against concrete bunkers. They were noise. For Kwajalein, the bombardment would run for 3 days. Not 3 hours, 3 days, and it would use armor-piercing rounds. Rounds designed not to explode on the surface, but to drive through it, to punch through reinforced concrete and detonate inside the structure that was supposed to protect the defenders. Second, the landing approach. At Betio, the assault came from the ocean side, the obvious side, the side the Japanese had spent 2 years fortifying. For Kwajalein, every landing would come from the lagoon side. The Japanese had focused their heaviest defences seaward. The lagoon approach was where the coral reefs were thinnest, where the water was deepest close to shore, where the fortifications were weakest. The Japanese had not believed American amphibious vehicles could cross the outer reef and attack from the lagoon. After Tarawa, they knew better, but the fortifications were already built. You cannot move concrete gun emplacements in 6 weeks. Third, the preliminary seizure of small islands. Before the main assault on Kwajalein Island and Rai Namur, American forces would land on the smaller islets surrounding the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, tiny pieces of coral, barely wide enough for a man to stand on in some places, but wide enough to set up artillery. By the night before the main assault, Army howitzers on Carlson Island had registered their guns on Kwajalein Island. Marine artillery on captured islets had zeroed in on Rai Namur. Every major target would be hit from land and sea simultaneously. Fourth, the underwater demolition teams. After Tarawa, the Navy began an experiment. The first 2 operational teams, UDT-1, UDT-2, small units of swimmers, whose job was to go in ahead of the landing craft and see what the men behind them were about to run into. They were not yet what they would become later in the war. They did not yet do the full underwater reconnaissance that would later save thousands of lives at Iwo Jima and Okinawa. But they were the beginning, the first practical answer to the question that had killed men at Tarawa. What is under the water we cannot see? Kwajalein was where they went to work for the first time. Fifth, the landing craft themselves, the LVTs, the amphibious tractors, had been modified, reinforced, redesigned, more of them, better armoured, better armed, enough to carry the first waves across the reef regardless of what the tide was doing on any given morning. 5 changes, none of them genius, all of them bought with the lives of the men who died at Tarawa. But there was one man at Kwajalein who took all 5 of those lessons and added something of his own. Rear Admiral Richard Connolly. He was 51 years old. He commanded the Northern Attack Force, the ships and Marines tasked with taking Rai and Namur, the twin islands at the north end of the atoll. Connolly was not a flashy commander. He was not famous. He was not the kind of admiral whose name ended up in newspaper headlines. He was an engineer's mind in an admiral's uniform. And he had a belief, simple, almost blunt, that he had been working toward for most of his career. You cannot destroy a fortified position by lobbing shells at it from a comfortable distance. A shell fired from 2 miles away arrives at an angle. It hits the roof of a bunker or the side or the ground in front of it. Some percentage of the time, it does real damage. The rest of the time, it does nothing the defenders can't walk away from. A shell fired from close range arrives nearly flat. It hits the face of the bunker directly. It has enough velocity to drive through the wall. Not just rattle it. If you want to destroy a hardened position, really destroy it, not just inconvenience it. You have to get close. This is what Connolly believed, and on the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, he decided to prove it. At 12 minutes past noon, Rear Admiral Connolly sent a signal to the battleship USS Maryland. The signal read, "Desire Maryland move in really close this afternoon for counter-battery and counter-blockhouse fire, using pointer fire for both main and secondary batteries." Move in really close, that phrase, in a navy that ran on precise technical language, operational codes, standardized communications, stood out like a man speaking plainly in a room full of formal speeches. Move in really close, not advance to coordinates, not reduce range to optimum firing distance. Close. Maryland moved. Tennessee followed. Maryland closed to within 1,500 yards of the Japanese shore, 1,500 yards, a little under a mile, within easy range of the Japanese coastal defense guns on Rai Namur, within the effective range of Japanese anti-aircraft artillery, repurposed for shore defense. The Japanese gunners could see the ship. The ship's crew could see the shore. They could watch through their gun sights individual coconut palms disintegrate as the 16-inch shells hit them at nearly point-blank range. The bunkers that had survived 2 days of conventional naval bombardment began to come apart. The Japanese defenders who had been sheltering inside them were no longer being rattled by near misses. They were being hit. From that afternoon forward, Richard Connolly had a nickname that would follow him for the rest of the war and the rest of his life. Close in Connolly. He had put his ships in danger to save his Marines. That is not a complicated calculation. In principle, every commander understands the trade-off in the abstract. What takes something more than understanding is the willingness to actually do it. To order your own ships into the range of enemy guns because you believe, down to your bones, that the men on the beach are worth more than the risk to your hull. Connolly believed it, and he proved it. The landings began before dawn. January 31st, 1944, rubber boats in the dark. Army soldiers from the 7th Infantry Divisions sliding over the sides of their ships and paddling quietly toward 4 small islands at the southern end of the atoll. Carlos, Carter, Cecil, Carlson, tiny pieces of land, the largest of them not much bigger than a city block, lightly defended. Most of the Japanese on them were support personnel, communications men, aviation ground crew, men who had never expected to be in a ground battle. By nightfall, the islands were American. The 145th Field Artillery Battalion had its howitzers on Carlson Island before midnight, gun crews working by flashlight, registering their weapons on targets across the water. Kwajalein Island, the main Japanese base in the south, was within range, 45 miles to the north. Marines from the 25th Regiment had done the same. 5 more small islands, 5 more artillery platforms. Rai Namur was zeroed in on the morning of February 1st. The bombardment that had been running for 3 days was joined by everything that had been waiting in reserve. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, land-based artillery from the captured islets, carrier aircraft from Task Force 58 on Kwajalein Island in the south. 7,000 naval rounds fell on the Japanese garrison in a single day. The artillery on Carlson added 29,000 more, 36,000 shells, on an island 2.5 miles long and less than half a mile wide. The Japanese had built their defences expecting to hold the beaches. They had built their strongest positions facing the ocean, the deep water, the obvious approach. They had not built for this. The Japanese commander in the atoll was Rear Admiral Monzo Akiyama. He had not commanded troops in ground combat before. He had been an administrator, a logistics officer, a career man who had risen through the peacetime navy and found himself, at the wrong moment, in charge of a position that was about to be hit harder than any island position in the war had been hit before. Akiyama sent messages to headquarters. He requested reinforcement. He requested air support. He requested guidance. There was no reinforcement to send. There was no air support that could reach him. The guidance he received was the guidance that Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific were receiving by that point in the war. Hold your position. He held it. He did what he could. He died on the second day of the ground battle, in the final collapse of the northern position. His body was never identified with certainty. At the northern end of the atoll, on Roy Island, the Marines went ashore from the lagoon side at 11:45 in the morning. The first wave crossed the reef in their LVTs, then the second wave, then the third. The defenders who came out of the bunkers were not the men who had gone in. 3 days of bombardment, 3 days of Connolly's ships, firing from 1,500 yards, had done something to the Japanese garrison on Roy that the planners had not quite dared to count on. It had broken them, not their will, exactly. The Japanese soldiers who emerged from the shattered concrete were still armed. Some of them still fought, but they came out dazed, disoriented, blinking into the smoke and the light like men who had been underground for a week. The Marines moved across the SV field. At 6 in the evening, 7 hours after the first wave hit the beach, the 23rd Marines declared Roy secure. 3,500 Japanese defenders, 1 island, 7 hours, at Tarawa. Betio had taken 76. But the story of February 1st on Roy is not just about what the bombardment did. It is about one man, who was not, on the day the guns fell silent, a name anyone knew. Private First Class Richard B.T. Anderson. Born June 26, 1921, Tacoma, Washington, he was 22 years old on the morning he crossed the reef at Roy. He had enlisted in the Marine Corps on July 6, 1942, 7 months after Pearl Harbor. He had been assigned to Company E, 2nd Battalion, 23rd Marine Regiment, 4th Marine Division. He was a mortarman. His job was in the rear, with his weapon, with his crew, providing indirect fire support for the infantry moving ahead of him. That was where a mortarman was supposed to be. On the afternoon of February 1st, 1944, Richard Anderson was not there. He was at the front, moving across the airfield on Roy Island with the rifle companies. In the middle of a battle, in the middle of a burning airfield, carrying grenades. The airfield on Roy had been cratered by 3 days of naval gunfire. Large craters, deep enough that a man could drop into one and disappear from sight. They offered cover. In the middle of the afternoon, Anderson spotted one of those craters ahead of him. He dropped into it. 3 other Marines were already inside. Anderson pulled a grenade, pulled the pin, started to throw. The grenade slipped. It happened in a fraction of a second, the kind of thing that happens to hands that are tired, or sweating, or shaking, or all 3, in the middle of a battle, in the heat of a Pacific Island afternoon. The grenade fell to the bottom of the crater, 4 men inside, no time to pick it up and throw it clear. No time to climb out, no time for anything except the one decision that Richard Anderson made in whatever fragment of a second he had. He threw himself on it. He took the full force of the explosion. He was pulled out of the crater and carried back, evacuated to the USS Callaway, a transport ship anchored in the lagoon. He died that day, February 1st, 1944. He was 22 years old. He was buried at sea with full military honours somewhere in the waters off Roy Namur. The 3 men in that crater with him walked off the island alive. Here is what the citation would eventually say: for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private First Class Anderson fearlessly chose to sacrifice himself and save his companions by hurling his body upon the grenade and taking the full impact of the explosion. He gallantly gave his life for his country. That is the language of the Medal of Honor. It is formal. It is precise. It is the language of citations written for men who did something that could not be explained any other way. But there is something the citation cannot tell you. Richard Anderson had a second and a half, maybe 2 seconds. That is what a grenade fuse gives you. In that second and a half, he understood what was about to happen. He understood what he could do about it, and he did it. Not because he was trained for that moment. There is no training for that moment. Not because he was thinking about medals. Nobody in a hole with a live grenade is thinking about medals. He did it because there were 3 men in the crater with him. And there was one thing that could keep them alive. And he was the only person in a position to do it. That is what actually happened on Roy Island on the afternoon of February 1st, 1944. Every reform Nimitz had put in place, every armor-piercing shell, every LVT, every UDT swimmer, every day of bombardment, every mile Connolly moved his battleships closer to shore. All of it had one purpose: to keep men like Richard Anderson from having to be in a hole with a live grenade in the first place. And it worked, for thousands of them. It did not work for him. The reforms could shape the battlefield. They could shorten the fight. They could reduce the number of men who ended up in the wrong place at the wrong moment. They could not eliminate the wrong place. They could not eliminate the wrong moment. Some things were still going to come down to a second and a half, and a young man who had to decide what to do with it. On August 17, 1944, 6 months and 16 days after Richard Anderson died, a ceremony was held at the naval station at Pier 91 in Seattle. His mother, Mrs. Oscar Anderson, stood at the front. She accepted the Medal of Honor on behalf of her son. She held the medal in her hands, and she went home. The following July, a destroyer was launched at the Todd Pacific shipyards in Seattle. On July 7, 1945, a year and 5 months after her son died, Mrs. Oscar Anderson was back at that waterfront this time, to christen the ship that would carry his name, USS Richard B. Anderson, DD 786. She would serve for 30 years, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, 3 decades of the United States Navy, carrying the name of a 22-year-old mortarman from Tacoma into waters her son never got to see. The battle for Kwajalein Island itself, the main Japanese base in the south, was harder than Roy. The 7th Infantry Division fought for 4 days. Building by building, bunker by bunker, the Japanese garrison did not surrender. They fought until they were dead. The island was declared secure on February 4th, when the final accounting was done. Across the entire atoll, Kwajalein Island in the south, Roy Namur in the north, the 30 smaller islets taken in between. The numbers looked like this: Japanese dead, more than 8,000. Japanese captured, a few hundred, most of them Korean laborers who had been brought to the islands by force and had no particular interest in dying for the emperor. Americans killed, 372. 372 men, across an operation involving 85,000 American troops and more than 300 warships, on a target defended by 8,000 Japanese soldiers. Now hold those numbers next to Tarawa, Betio Island, 2 miles long, less than half a mile wide, 4,500 Japanese defenders, Americans killed, more than 1,000. Kwajalein Atoll, 8,000 defenders, more than twice the size, Americans killed, 372, less than a third of the Tarawa toll, against nearly twice the enemy force. The military planners had estimated, based on everything they knew, based on the precedent of Tarawa, based on the density of Japanese fortifications, that Kwajalein would take longer and cost more. They were wrong, in the best possible way. Nimitz had expected the operation to take until mid-February. Kwajalein Island fell on February 4th. Roy Namur had fallen on February 2nd. He was weeks ahead of schedule. On February 5th, Nimitz flew in. He had done this before, landed on a newly taken island before the engineers had finished clearing it. He walked the ground. In the days that followed, as prisoner interrogations came back, a picture emerged of what was waiting at Eniwetok, the next major atoll in the chain, 400 miles to the northwest. The Japanese garrison there was smaller than expected, the fortifications less developed. The window to hit it before it could be reinforced was open. Right now, Nimitz did not call another meeting. He did not ask his commanders to form a committee. He called Spruance, the same man who had told him, 2 months earlier, that going straight to Kwajalein was dangerous and reckless. He told Spruance to take Eniwetok immediately, with the reserves that had not been used at Kwajalein. The operation that had been scheduled for early May would happen now. Nearly 3 months ahead of schedule, Spruance said yes. He did not argue. He did not say you were right and I was wrong. He did not have to. He just executed the order. Eniwetok fell by February 23rd, when the war ended, when the last signatures were put on the documents on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2nd, 1945. The name Kwajalein did not appear prominently in the headlines. It did not appear in most of the headlines at all. Tarawa was famous, Iwo Jima was famous, Peleliu and Guadalcanal and Okinawa, battles that had cost thousands of American lives, were part of the national memory. Kwajalein was not, and in a strange way, that absence tells you everything. History is drawn to the places where the most was lost, where the price was highest, where the photographs were most devastating, where the casualty lists ran longest, where the families back home had the most grief to hold. Kwajalein was won too cleanly to make that kind of history. Kwajalein is the battle history forgot, because it went right. But the men who did not come home from it were not an abstraction. They were somebody's son, somebody's husband, somebody's father. They were from Tacoma and Georgia and Ohio, who had grown up in the years between the wars, during the Depression, in a country that was still figuring out what it was and what it owed the world. They had answered a question none of them had wanted to be asked, and on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that most Americans cannot place on a map. They had done what was asked of them. There is one more thing worth saying. If your grandfather served in the Pacific, if your father was one of the young men who shipped out from San Diego or San Francisco in the first years after Pearl Harbor. There is a chance he was at Kwajalein, or on a ship in that lagoon, or on one of the escort carriers circling overhead, or on one of the transport ships standing off the atoll while the guns fired and the smoke rose and the men on the beach moved forward. He may never have told you about it. The men of that generation did not, as a rule, tell, not because there was nothing to say, because some things happened at a level below language, below the kind of words that work at a dinner table, or in a living room on a Sunday afternoon with grandchildren in the room. Some things they carried quietly, not as a burden, necessarily, just as weight, the ordinary weight of having been somewhere and seen something that changed the way the world looked afterward. There are stories that exist only in the memories of the people who were there, stories that were never written down, never recorded, never told to anyone except maybe a wife late at night, or a buddy from the same unit at a reunion years later. Stories that will disappear when the last people who carry them are gone. If you have one of those stories, if you heard something at a dinner table, or in a car on a long drive, or in the last years of someone's life when they finally started to talk, leave it in the comments. Write down what you remember, even if it is only a fragment. Even if you do not know all the names or all the places. Write it down, because those men deserve to be remembered by the full weight of what they did. Not just by the battles that made the front pages, but by the ones that did not, by Kwajalein, by the names no headline carried, but their families never lost.